Zero hedge, once again. Speaking of central banks and nonsense, the central bank's central bank, if you will, Bank for International Settlements, or BIS, lists the 4 biggest threats facing the global economy. Again, why? What do you mean threats? We had bailout 2008 and 9. We had TARP funds. We have $4.5 trillion added to the Fed's balance sheet from $800 billion. Everything's fine, man. What are you talking about? Threats? There's no threat. Life is good. Unemployment's down to 4.3%. Right? I mean, what are they talking? What do you mean threats? What is this? After years of fire and brimstone sermons, also known as the Bank of International Settlements annual reports, delivered with doom and gloomy aplomb and by Jamie Caruana, or is that Caruana, the 2014 report in which the BIS was shocked at how broken the market has become, was a particular favorite, who year after year warned about the adverse side effects of central bank interventions. Today, the BIS released its most upbeat report in years, in which it praised the recent rebound of global growth and predicted that GDP may soon revert to long-term average levels after the sharp improvement in sentiment over the past year. Oh, so it's sentiment that does this. Oh, okay, so if sentiment is up, then... Oh, okay, got it. Or maybe not, because even as talk of a global coordinated rebound continues, it has once again rolled over, with the U.S. economy barely growing above stall speed, while the BIS explicitly notes that despite the best near-term prospects for a long time, paradoxes and tensions abound. Among these are the VIX. Financial market volatility has plummeted even as indicators of policy uncertainty have surged, and the record disconnect between equities and bonds. Stock markets have been buoyant, but bond yields have not risen commensurately. Meanwhile, optimism, at least as measured by various sentiment surveys such as the PMI and consumer confidence, is the highest since the financial crisis, even as globalization, a powerful engine of world growth, has slowed and come under a protectionist threat. While praising the recent economic rebound, the BIS notes that the main theme of this year's annual report is the sustainability of the current expansion. Specifically, what are the medium-term risks? What should policy do about them? And can we take advantage of the opportunities that a stronger economy offers? And of particular focus are the following 4 main risks, aside from geopolitical, listed by the BIS that could undermine the sustainability of the upswing. Number 1, first, a significant rise in inflation could choke the expansion by forcing central banks to tighten policy more than expected. And speaking of tightening policy, did you just see my last video about quantitative tightening? Hey, interesting. This typical post-war scenario moved into focus last year, even in the absence of any evidence of a resurgence of inflation. Second, and less appreciated, serious financial stress could materialize as financial cycles mature if their contraction phase were to turn into a more serious bust. This is what happened most spectacularly with the Great Financial Crisis. Third, short of serious financial stress, consumption might weaken under the weight of debt, and investment might fail to take over as the main growth engine. There is evidence that consumption-led growth is less durable, not least because it fails to generate sufficient increases in productive capital. And fourth, a rise in protectionism could challenge the open global economic order. History shows that trade tensions can sap the global economy's strength. And you know, old Donald Trump, he's taking the protectionism approach. America First approach. Conveniently, just yesterday, we reported that, as Goldman noted on Friday, virtually every post-World War II recession was caused by the Fed's reaction to a spike in inflation, usually in the commodity sector, which itself may have been prompted by aggressively easy monetary conditions by central banks during the prior cycle. Separately, Citi, as in Citigroup, discussed just how late stage the current cycle, showing that, according to pairwise correlations, a recession may be imminent. Maybe? Uh, Knowing the kind of videos I've been doing the first part of this year so far to date, I'd say it sure is crap. As for the BIS, this is how it summarizes the overarching threats. Policy tightening to contain an inflation spurt could trigger or amplify a financial bust in the more vulnerable countries. This would be especially true if higher policy rates coincided with a snapback in bond yields and US dollar appreciation. The strong post-crisis expansion of dollar-denominated debt has raised vulnerabilities, particularly in some emerging market economies. On the topic of surging rates, one has to keep in mind the amount of dollar-denominated emerging market credit. From 2009 to end of 2016, US dollar credit to non-banks located outside the US, a bellwether BIS or Bank for National Settlements indicator of global liquidity, soared by around 50% to some $10.5 trillion. For those in EMEs alone, it more than doubled to $3.6 trillion. But an even greater problem than an inflationary spurt facing the Fed is the record global debt overhang. Should Yellen et al. Hike rates too fast, the debt pyramid could implode under its own weight as debt service costs explode. An overarching issue is the global economy's sensitivity to higher interest rates given the continued accumulation of debt in relation to GDP, complicating the policy normalization process. As another example, a withdrawal into trade protectionism could spark financial strains and make even higher inflation more likely, and the emergence of systemic financial strains yet again, or simply much slower growth, could heighten the protectionist threat beyond critical levels. Charted, global debt has continued to climb to new all-time highs, while predictably rates and yields have declined to never-before-seen levels. And yet, despite these great latent risks, mostly due to high debt levels, low productivity growth, and dwindling policy firepower, according to Reuters, the BIS said central banks should take advantage of the improving economic outlook and its surprisingly negligible effect on inflation to accelerate the great unwinding of quantitative easing programs and record low interest rates. Of course, if the improving conditions are a result of central bank policies, this intervention will be very brief. New technologies and working practices are likely to be playing a role in suppressing inflation, it said, though normal impulses should kick in if unemployment continues to drop. Since we are now emerging from a very long period of very accommodative monetary policy, whatever we do, we will have to do it in a very careful way. BIS's head of research, Song Shin, told Reuters. Shin, one of the more rational voices within the BIS, said that if we leave it too late, it is going to be much more difficult to accomplish that unwinding. Even if there are some short-term humps or bumps in the road, it would be much more advisable to stay the course and begin that process of normalization. End quote. It may be too late. As Citi's Matt King warned, the moment normalization officially begins and is no longer just a bluff, markets will flounder, which is why Shin added that it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to remove all the central bank bumps. Ironically, the biggest question in the report was one that was not explicitly stated. How long can the Fed tighten before the next recessions sends rates crashing back to zero, if not negative, and unleashes even more quantitative easing? Or as Reuters puts it, the Bank for International Settlement report added that the lack of clarity over inflation also makes it harder to judge how far rates could go up before they start coming down again. In practice, therefore, central banks have little alternative but to move without a firm end point in mind. The report said, another way of saying they are flying blind. Finally, the report discusses the growing threat of protectionism, perhaps the most dangerous of the four main risks it identified. Again, Donald Trump's stance, America first, that's protectionist point of view. When he went and met the G10 or 20, he left that, which he actually wasn't him, he sent Secretary of State over there. It was clear we're taking a protectionist view. In a sidebar to the main report, the BIS estimated that if 10% tariffs were put on imports from Mexico or China, U.S. labor costs would have to drop by about 6% to compensate for the higher costs of imported inputs. Translated, crashing wages and political upheaval once globalization goes into reverse in earnest. The BIS simulation reveals a comparatively large sensitivity of United States production costs to tariffs on imports from Mexico or China. To put the resulting cost shocks into context, the center panel of graph 3, whatever, I'm not going to show it, displays the reduction in U.S. wages that would be required to fully compensate for the increasing cost. Matter of fact, maybe I will. Hang on. Compensate for the increasing cost of imported inputs. For example, such tariffs would lead to a 0.86% cost increase in the U.S. transportation industry. To fully offset that increase, U.S. labor costs would have to decrease by around 6%, satisfying 0.86% minus 6% times 0.14, where 0.14 is the labor cost share in the U.S. transportation equipment industry. So let's click on this and take a peek. Well, that's a different one. Hold on. Wasn't it this one? They've got it linked to the wrong graph, so never mind. Needless to say, the BIS, which has or was created in the post-World War II vacuum to promote global trade, clearly is conflicted when it comes to globalization and says that formal statistical evidence, casual observation, and plain logic indicate that globalization has been a major force supporting world growth and higher living standards. Unfortunately, when it comes to the middle class, the data clearly points to the opposite direction. So, once again, Bank for International Settlements, one of the elites, the central bank, they do have some concerns, of course. Their biggest concern, without naming names, Donald Trump's policy. Protectionism, America first. That's not going to work in our globalization view, which means a lot of pain may have to come to us Americans so that we are upset about Donald Trump and we're going to vote him out in 2020. Oh, we don't want him. Look what he did. He ruined everything. When in reality, he didn't do that. He tried to fix everything. And as you can see, he's getting stopped at every point, every turn. But anyways, that's it for now. Take care.